Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 127th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were begun in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State University to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Senator Chuck Hagel to the Landon podium to join 126 predecessors in bringing their thoughts and opinions on important public issues. Before introducing Senator Hagel, I'd like to introduce the other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Al Cochran, Professor of Music and President of the Faculty Senate. Next to him, Zach Cook, a senior in biological and agricultural engineering and our student body president. On my right, chairman of the Landon Patrons, Edward Seaton, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Ed? Next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president and chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Well, Senator, we are so pleased to have you here today, and we know you have a very, very busy schedule, and God bless you for coming to K-State. Senator Chuck Hagel was reelected to his second term to the U.S. Senate in November of 2002. He received 83% of the votes, representing the biggest political victory in Nebraska history. Not bad, 83%. Senator Hagel is a member of 3 Senate committees: Foreign Relations, Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, and the Select Committee on Intelligence. He also serves as co-chairman of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China. Since his election to the Senate in 1996, Hagel has served as Deputy Whip for the Republican Caucus. He's been chair of both the Senate Global Climate Change Observer Group and the Senate Oversight Task Force. He also serves on the NATO Observer Group. A fourth-generation Nebraskan from Columbus, Nebraska, Senator Hagel graduated from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He received a Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Creighton University, and an honorary doctorate of Commerce from Bellevue University. The recipient of many honors, Hagel was recognized this year by the National School Board Association for his commitment to fully funding the Individuals with Disabilities Act. He received the 2002 George W. Norris Distinguished Lecturer Award and the 2001 Horatio Alger Award from the Horatio Alger Association. He also received the 2000 Legislator of the Year Award from the Vietnam Veterans Association of America and has been inducted into the Consumers for World Trade Hall of Fame. Senator Hagel has received the American Farm Bureau Federation's Gold Plow Award. Senator Hagel is a highly decorated Vietnam veteran. He received 2 Purple Hearts, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, the Army Commendation Medal, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. Ladies and gentlemen, without question, Senator Hagel is one of the rising stars in the United States Senate, and his leadership ability has already been recognized by his fellow senators. As all of you know here from watching cable TV and the national networks, in the past 2 to 3 months, Senator Hagel has appeared on many, many television news shows and recently expressing his views on the U.S.-Iraq situation. It is a great pleasure and an honor for me and for all of us at K-State to welcome Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska to the Landon podium.
Thank you. Mr. President, thank you. I am grateful for an opportunity to participate in this very distinguished lecture series. I acknowledge forthwith that being a Cornhusker, I am not worthy of being even on your campus. And there was some debate whether I should even accept this invitation. After counseling with Frank Solich and Tom Osborne and others, they thought I might be able to redeem the Cornhuskers after what you did to them, which we will not forget, by the way. You do come to Lincoln, I believe.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right, next year.
Next year. I am here also because your Senator Pat Roberts gave me a visa for the day to cross state lines. I must be out by sundown, and I will be. Pat Roberts is a dear friend, close colleague, as you, I'm sure, know. He has just recently assumed a very significant responsibility as the new chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Those of you who know Roberts are probably concerned. There's no question he has confused our enemies. He is a very serious legislator and a dear friend, and I very much appreciate serving with Pat, as well as your other Senator, Sam Brownback, who I serve with on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I want to thank, certainly, the faculty, those of you who have over so many years, kept this significant and relevant lecture series alive, and as you have developed it, have made a national, in fact, international impact on elevated discourse of the great issues of our day. So I appreciate what you've all done to keep this alive, and of course to the student body. I noted to the President that you have student elections coming up here this month, and they've started. The President's retiring, I understand, to greater glory. But without student government and student leadership, our country would not work near as well, nor the great issues of our time challenged and debated as effectively as they need to be effective and debated. Governor Landon understood quite clearly the complexity of America's role in a dynamic world, evidenced by his 1966 inaugural speech here to kick off this distinguished lecture series. The title of Governor Landon's speech in 1966, quite relevant to today. The title of his speech was New Challenges in International Relations. Governor Landon represents the finest tradition of American public service that we've come to expect from Kansas and its elected representatives. Leaders like Alf Landon and one of the greatest leaders of our time, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Kansas Senators Nancy Landon Cassabaum Baker and Bob Dole, our friends, whom I greatly admire and look to as role models in the U.S. Senate. And as I have said, I'm proud to serve with your two senators, Pat Roberts and Sam Brownback. And I would be less than forthright, and you know politicians are always forthright, if I did not qualify my enthusiasm on the record for Kansas State by saying, except for the Kansas State Wildcat football team, I remain an unabashed fan of all good things from Manhattan. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin my lecture this morning by recalling a speech at a Midwestern college at another critical time in our history. Almost 57 years ago, on March 5th, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, not far from here, Winston Churchill, with another great Midwestern leader, President Harry Truman, at his side, gave one of the greatest speeches of our time. The speech's power and majesty are not limited to time and place, although Churchill's warning of a Soviet Iron Curtain in Europe vividly captured the communist threat of that era. That day in Fulton, Churchill also conveyed something unique and special about America's role in the world. And he said, almost 57 years ago, quote, "The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with this primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future. As you look around you, you must feel not only the sense of duty alone, but also you must feel anxiety, lest you fall below the level of achievement. Opportunity is here, now, clear and shining, for both our countries. To reject it or ignore it or fritter it away will bring upon us all the long reproaches of the aftertime." End of quote. With new eras come new challenges. And today, America again stands at a pinnacle of power and again bears a heavy burden for securing a better tomorrow for our citizens and for all the peoples of the world. At this critical juncture, the success of our actions will be determined not by the extent of our power, but by an appreciation of its limits. America must approach the world with a sense of purpose in world affairs that is anchored by our ideals, a principled realism that seeks not to remake the world in our image, but to help make a better world. We must avoid the traps of hubris and imperial temptation that comes with great power. Our foreign policy should reflect the hope and promise of America, tempered with a mature wisdom that is the mark of our national character. In this new era of possibilities and responsibilities, America will require a wider lens view of how the world sees us, so that we can better understand the world and our role in the world. Just as Churchill pointed out in 1946, when historic opportunities for leadership are before us, they cannot be rejected, ignored, or frittered away. There would have been grave consequences for the world if America had shrunk from her responsibilities in 1946, as there will be grave consequences if America shrinks from today's challenges. We stand today on the verge of military conflict in Iraq and a long-term engagement with the Middle East that offers as much peril as promise. We also face an urgent threat from North Korea and the potential for nuclear war between India and Pakistan. The HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa, Russia, and Asia poses one of the most deadly and urgent threats to all humanity. And we cannot overlook our own hemisphere, where Colombia and Venezuela face continued violence and instability. The complexities of an interconnected world give us little margin for error in dealing with these great international challenges. The first priority for America, as for all sovereign nations, is to protect its citizens. But to do so, we must build and sustain global institutions and alliances that share our interests and our values and the threats that confront us all. Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior under President Franklin Roosevelt, put it powerfully in a speech on May 18, 1941, when he said in response to those who urged America to stay out of World War II, that American support for Britain was not the right thing to do. But Secretary Ickes said, in regard to American support of Britain, quote, "That support is the sort of enlightened selfishness that makes the wheels of history go round. It is the sort of enlightened selfishness that wins victories. Do you know why? Because we cannot live in the world alone, without friends and without allies." End of quote. Then as now, the serious obligations of world leadership come with a price. Bearing the burdens and costs of leadership in defeating global terrorism, countering proliferation by nations and terrorist networks, and ending poverty and hunger in the world and the dark recesses of the globe, are investments in our own security, as well as in the stability and security of the world. Security at home cannot be separated from dangers abroad. We surely learned that in this country on September 11th, 2001. The war against international terrorism and its sponsors is a war unlike any we've ever known. There is no battlefield, no clash of great armies. It is a war fought in the shadows and recesses of the world. Terrorism breeds among the hopeless and the alienated, in societies where democracy and economic opportunity are out of reach for most people. Military power alone will not end this scourge of mankind. Victory will require extensive international cooperation in the intelligence, economic, diplomatic, law enforcement, and humanitarian fields. It will require a seamless network of cooperation between America and her allies. Terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are the enemies of all people, not just Americans. We must build relationships upon this common denominator of common interests and common threats. America cannot defeat terrorism alone. America's ability to build lasting and flexible coalitions will be the measure of our success, the only assured means of long-term security for future generations. As we consider our next steps in Iraq, we cannot lose sight of the wider lens view of what is before us, and that this is about much more than Iraq. We are setting the tone for America's role in the world for the next decade and beyond. At this critical time, our policies and our rhetoric should not create distance between America and her allies. If that is the price of waging war in Iraq, then victory in the long run, in the war on terrorism, in the Middle East, on the Korean Peninsula, and against weapons of mass destruction, will not be ours. And as Churchill reminded us, the after-time, the long term, is what measures victory. America must remain on a steady course and turn the Saddam Hussein threat into an opportunity to empower alliances and institutions committed to disarmament in Iraq, North Korea, Iran, and elsewhere. Today, America stands nearly alone in proclaiming the urgency of the use of force to disarm Saddam Hussein. In Europe and in many corners of the globe, America is perceived as determined to use force in Iraq to the exclusion of world opinion or the interest of our allies, even those allies who share our concerns about Saddam Hussein's weapons program. America must balance its determination with patience and not be seen as in a rush to war. As David Ignatius wrote in a recent Washington Post column, quote, A nation heading into war needs prudence and good judgment. America's best generals, people such as Grant and Marshall and Eisenhower, were at once cautious and decisive. Their greatness lay in the fact that they never lost sight of the long-term interests of the United States. End of quote. America must steer away from actions that could produce the unintended results of fracturing these very institutions that have helped keep peace since World War II. Allowing a rush to war in Iraq to create divisions in those institutions and alliances that will help sustain American security and world stability is short-sighted and dangerous. In order for America to address the differences between ourselves and our allies, we must understand those differences, seek to understand those differences. We don't enhance our relationships and bridge those differences by impugning the motives of our friends. Let us not forget, they too are democracies. They too are accountable to their people and respond to the judgment of their citizens. Isn't that the essence of our noble purpose as democratic governments? We must listen and learn, then forge a coalition based upon our common interests. The diplomatic challenges before us should not weaken our resolve to obtain a second UN resolution that threatens serious consequences for Iraq's continued defiance of UN resolutions. While time may be short, the diplomatic option has not yet played out. It will take more hard work, and the military option should always remain on the table. The world has additional time, and we should not short-circuit what has begun through legitimate United Nations channels. This responsible course will maximize the force of world opinion and bring it to our side. American purpose requires more than the application of American power to rid Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction, although that will be our first priority. War, if it is necessary, should be a means, not an end, to achieve a plan of action to encourage conflict resolution and peaceful change in Iraq and throughout the Middle East. Iraq cannot be considered in a vacuum, detached from the politics and the culture of both its region and the Muslim world. Using military force to disarm Saddam Hussein will bring change to Iraq and to the region, but we cannot foresee the nature of that change. What comes after Saddam Hussein? The uncertainties of a post-Saddam, post-conflict of Middle East should give us pause, encourage prudence, and enforce us to recognize the necessity of coalitions, seeing it through. America will need to remain in Iraq and the Middle East to help lead this post-Saddam transition. This will require adroit diplomacy, long-term commitment, and dynamic coalition building. There is no other way. Regime change in Iraq will not alone be the endgame for a region devoid of democratic institutions, economic development, and effective regional organizations. It must be seen as only the beginning of a long transitional period towards stability, development, and individual freedom for millions who have never known the hope and promise of an open and free society. How do we meet these opportunities and challenges now before us? Allow me to suggest 5 priorities for U.S. policy toward Iraq, which will be critical in helping support and sustain stability and prosperity in the Middle East in the years ahead. First, a post-Saddam transition in Iraq must focus on security, economic stability, and creating the conditions for democratic change. We should not put aside the mistaken delusion that democracy is just around the corner in Iraq, or that by force of arms we can remove Saddam and simultaneously place Iraq on the path to democracy by overlaying a blueprint for democracy on the region, a so-called democratic domino effect. The spade work of building a free Iraq will take time. General Anthony Zinni, Special Advisor to the Secretary of State and former Commanding General, U.S. Central Command, reminded the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week that, with regard to Iraq, quote, there will not be a spontaneous democracy. So the reconstruction of the country will be a long, hard course of action, regardless of whether a modest vision of the end state is sought or a more ambitious one is chosen. End of quote. The end of Saddam Hussein's regime will be all to the good. But building nations and democracy in the Middle East or anywhere is complicated and difficult, and success is never assured. We can try to help create the conditions for democratic change, but we must assume that it will not come quickly, cheaply, or easily. Second, the United States should place its operations in a post-Saddam Iraq under a United Nations umbrella as soon as possible. The conspicuous American occupation force in Iraq or in any Arab or Muslim country would only fuel anti-Americanism, nationalism, and resentment. By working through the United Nations, America will neutralize the accusations that a war in Iraq is anti-Muslim or driven by oil interests or American imperialism. Third, America should encourage the convening of a regional conference to deal with outstanding Iraqi and regional security issues as soon as possible. The Middle East has a lack of regional political institutions to deal with conflict prevention and resolution. The end of Saddam Hussein's regime will not necessarily mean the end of long-standing border disputes between Iraq and its neighbors, Turkey, Iran, and Kuwait, disputes that predate Saddam Hussein. Stability in northern Iraq is not assured. I was in northern Iraq in December. Given the potential for conflict between Turkey and Iraq's Kurdish parties, a regional conference arranged under United Nations auspices would play an important role in building confidence among the states of the region so that future conflicts can be prevented. Fourth, America must act immediately to restart the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. There will be no lasting peace between Israel and her Arab neighbors without America taking the lead to broker a lasting settlement. As President George H.W. Bush did after the first Gulf War, any military action in Iraq should be accompanied by a renewed American initiative to help settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The road to peace in the Middle East does not end in Baghdad. Long-term stability in the Middle East depends on the progress toward Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I was in Israel and 6 Arab countries in December and met with the leaders of each of those nations. I was on the West Bank and met with Palestinian leaders. There is no other way. We must work with our quartet partners, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, as well as Israel, the Palestinians, and our Arab allies to put the peace effort back on track. There is good news that there are discussions being held in London today between the quartet under American leadership with involvement from high government officials from the government of Israel and Palestinian officials. Every day that passes without active American mediation contributes to the radicalization of Palestinian and Arab politics and the likelihood of greater terrorism being visited on Israel. Fifth, America should create partnerships with the governments and peoples of the Arab world to take the necessary steps to help them open up their political systems and economies, such as the Middle East Partnership Initiative proposed by President Bush to encourage democratic, educational, and economic reforms. Senator Joe Lieberman and I will introduce legislation soon to promote private sector development and educational reform in the Middle East. For too long, the governments of this region have deferred or opposed governmental and societal reform. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, paraphrasing Bismarck, once said that, quote, "Modern politics too often produces an orgy of self-righteousness amidst a cacophony of sounds." End of quote. If we do not complement our disarmament efforts in Iraq with a program of peaceful change in the Middle East, our policies may encourage the perception of a hard-edged American security doctrine that offers little more than self-righteous ideology. That would result in many in the Arab and Muslim worlds seeing their interests as being compromised to American power. Instead of contributing to stabilization and democratization in the Middle East, just the opposite could occur. A war in Iraq could intensify the radicalization of the region's politics. America's purpose in the world requires a commitment to a kind of principled realism that promotes our values, strengthens international institutions, builds coalitions, and recognizes what is possible. The opportunities for helping create a better world are as real today as any time in our history, just as they were when Churchill spoke at Westminster College 57 years ago. Opportunities for moments of reflection during times of great decision are rare and are fleeting, but they are crucial in order to place the events of today in an important perspective. Churchill, Eisenhower, Truman, Marshall, and other world leaders understood the magnitude of the challenges in the world, and they understood what the world would face in the second half of the 20th century. We face comparable challenges today, and we can learn from history. It was America's investment in international institutions, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NATO, and other institutions, many others, which help maintain world stability and prevent world wars. These and other multinational institutions have given a structure and a force to global consensus and commitment to face the challenges of our time. America has helped build and reinforce these institutions with a judicious use of its power. All nations and institutions are imperfect. Our government is imperfect. But the world today is more hopeful and more just because America and her friends took this responsible and far-sighted course of action with coalitions of common interests and multinational institutions. What distinguishes America is not our power, for the world has known great power. It is America's purpose and our commitment to making a better life for all people. That is the America the world needs to see. A wise, thoughtful, and steady nation, worthy of its power, generous of spirit, and humble in its purpose. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Superb.
Thank you very much. We're going to take some questions? Good.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. Great presentation. I know we all enjoyed it so much. Well, typically then we have this opportunity for questions and answers. So as you know, we have microphones on your left and on your right. So without hesitation, we'll move to the questions, and the Senator has indicated that he'd be more than happy to answer them. So we'll start on the left over here.
Senator Hagel, thank you very much for being here. I'm sure we all appreciated your comments. In the Kansas City Star on this Monday, there was an excerpt from the Robert Byrd speech in the United States Senate, which he delivered on February 12th, where I would characterize the speech as saying, regarding a war in Iraq, not this war, not at this time. Your position seems to be If I could characterize Robert Byrd's position as being one of restraint, I'm hearing you also urging a great deal of restraint, and which is especially noteworthy given the kind of the bellicose posture that our current Republican administration is taking. So I would place you closer to Byrd than I would to the current president. How do you respond to that?
That's the first time anyone has placed me close to Bob Byrd. I respect Senator Byrd, but I'm not sure in this case I am in the camp of a hawk or a dove. I prefer more to be a wise old owl here on this. And Bob Byrd has some important points to make, as he did make them. We should listen to all points of view. But as I said in my comments, and I have consistently taken this position, that the question has never been whether Saddam Hussein is in violation of 17 UN resolution, whether he can be rehabilitated, whether he is a threat to the world. He is in clear violation of the 17 UN resolutions. He is a threat to the world, and I don't believe he can be rehabilitated. Now, that said, and by the way, I think that position is the position of every one of our allies. I've never heard France, Germany, Turkey, Canada, any of our allies say that, well, I think we can fix the problem. The difference is this: how we do it, the process we use, keeping our allies and the UN structure together to do it. I have said I don't believe that Saddam Hussein is an urgent threat to the security interests of the United States. Is he a threat? Yes. Could he be a bigger threat? Yes. But let's look at some facts. For 12 years, we've had him bottled up. Now, has he outlived what everyone thought was going to eventually happen to him? Absolutely. There aren't many people 12 years ago who'd have given you much in the way of odds predicting that he'd still be around 12 years later. But he is, and we're dealing with it. Now, I think we must be wise, as I believe other individuals and allies, in how we deal with him. Because, as I said in my remarks, we have to deal with it. And the UN inspections have never were intended to be, and I've never heard anyone say that they are an indefinite process. They are not. That process will end, and there's some debate about should it end next week or in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. And I'm not sure what the date is. I would leave that to Blix and others, and I think the Security Council has a rather good handle on this, and I think we have the time to let that play 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it's going to be. But in the end, as I said in my comments, after Saddam has gone, there is no assurance that we will get control of whatever stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction he has, or even if we'll be able to identify them with a military incursion. We could actually make things worse if we're not careful how we do this. How is that, Senator? Well, we don't know where those stockpiles are. We know he had some. We don't know if he got rid of them or didn't. We have to assume that he did not. We have to assume that he's lied all the way through. That's his behavior. That's his pattern. So we have to assume the worst. Now, if we are not careful, a lot of these weapons of mass destruction, or at least components, or certainly biological chemical stockpiles, could leak out, may well be leaking out now. You heard the reports that started circulating in the news yesterday about the 3 ships that are out on the high seas that have had no radio contact. Very bizarre, very strange. We don't know what's in those ships. Could be stockpiles of biological chemical weapons. These are complications that we are having to deal with as we think this through. Now, let's say everything goes pretty well. There's a minimum loss of life. We get this done fairly well. Then in the end, what do you have? What do you have? Could you further destabilize the Middle East? Oh, I think you could. Could you make it worse? I think you could. Do you run the risk, if he lobs a few Scud missiles over at Israel, biologically, chemically tipped, that Israel does not respond, maybe even with a tactical nuclear weapon? That's all part of the big equation here that we have to think through. And we hope it doesn't happen, but you can't plan the future of mankind by hope. Hope is part of it, but you have to do better than that. So we're going to have to be there for a long time afterward to try to clean it up, to try to make something out of that mess. And it is complicated. A lot of things we don't even understand. So I've gone longer than you needed to have in an answer, and you wanted, I'm sure. But I think it's that complicated, and I think for anyone to try to fit any of us in a category, it doesn't work, because these are complicated issues, and as I said, the margin of error is so very small today because of these complications that a calibration one way or the other could bring tremendous disaster on a part of the world which would impact on us. We all understand that. So that's the way I'd answer it, and I wouldn't say I'm closer to Bob Byrd or George Bush. We need to deal with Saddam, and I think the process the President put us on in September is the correct process. That's going through the United Nations. There are those in the administration who do not believe, never did believe, that that was the right course. Many are second-guessing it and blaming Colin Powell for trying to push the President and encourage and convince the President to go that way. I think Powell was right. My opinion is, thank God for all of us, that Colin Powell is Secretary of State. Thank you.
Last week, you were involved in a public discussion with Douglas Frith, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and Mark Grossman, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. And the discussion was about rebuilding Iraq. And personally, I wasn't very assured that these policymakers have really thought through how they're going to rebuild Iraq. And so I was just wondering what your take of that meeting was. And also, because the United States can't allow the number of failed nations to continue to grow, the United States may be involved more and more in nation building. And so, is there now, or do you think there should be, some group of people getting together to try to figure out what are the fundamentals of nation building, so that every time we get involved in nation building, we don't haphazardly try to piece something together?
Well, you have touched upon something that's, I think, very important. It's getting not enough attention from the administration. I have been asking these questions for a long time. I started asking these questions in the summer, and I was about the only one out there asking these questions. And you should read some of my mail. Why don't you just shut your mouth, Senator, and do what the President says? That's your job. Don't ask those stupid questions. You're complicating the President's life. He's smarter than you think he is. He's smarter than you, but that's all part of what the business is about. That hearing that you referred to before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and if you watched any of it on C-SPAN, you know what I said, and I spoke rather plainly to both of those two undersecretaries. And I said, I don't think you have the answers. I don't think you're anywhere near having any answers. And they couldn't give us any answers, if you remember. And I think I said, if you can't give us answers today, then I think I said, how in the hell do you think you're going to find answers when you've got American men and women trapped in Iraq fighting a war? If we learned nothing from Vietnam, we should have learned that. Now, I'm not one who tries to make parallel comparisons here in many ways that I don't think you can between Vietnam and today. But there are some parallels. Interestingly enough, that effort in Vietnam, as well-intentioned as it was, I believe, and I think our cause was noble, was done unilaterally. The UN wasn't involved. In Korea, we fought under the UN flag. Now, we did most of the fighting, yes, but we were the only country at that time in 1950 capable. But the lesson you learn is America gets into trouble. Great powers always get into trouble when they break from a collateral alliance coalition path and try to remake a world or remake a country by themselves. It will always end in disaster. It always has. And so the questions that many of us ask, I'm not the only one asking them, that you referred to in that hearing are very important questions to ask. Now, this is imperfect. I know that. Wars are imperfect. You can't plan everything and every detail and every answer. Of course not. But we got to do a lot better job than we have, in my opinion, of thinking this through. That's why we need coalitions. That's why we need alliances. That's why we need, in my opinion, the things I talked about in my speech. Because once we get through this wind tunnel, and we will, we're playing for the other side of the wind tunnel. There must be something that we can use and build that's better than where we've been. We are going to have to build something better than what we've had. That's why this is critical. That's why these questions are critical. That's why the administration needs to spend some more time on this. That's why we can't do it alone. We're not going to win a war on terrorism alone. That's complete folly, dangerous folly. We need allies. We need friends. We need an enhancement of America's relationships around the world. We need to reverse the optics of how the world sees us, not just how we, the great power on earth, sees the world. And if you disagree with us, then you're wrong. If the UN disagrees with us, they're wrong. We're always right. That's dangerous. And it is difficult to deal with this. The President of the United States, George Bush, I believe, has been faced with the biggest immediate crisis of any president in the history of our country. Lincoln knew what he was about to deal with. Slavery, the breakup of the Federal Republic, had been on the agenda, debated in Congress, editorialized on for a number of years before Lincoln was elected president. Franklin Roosevelt knew exactly what he was having to deal with, would deal with, before he was elected in 1932. This president was hit with this immense catastrophe where there are no answers. We've never been this way before. There's no blueprint here to deal with this. So that's why it's smarter, in my opinion, to ask the questions now, to probe. I'm on the president's side. I want the president to win. This isn't a matter of I'm on Bob Byrd's side or the president's side. All America's on the president's side. Why? Because it's in our interest. It's in the interest of our future, our children, our grandchildren. We've got to come out of this the right way. And the president's the president. So we need to help him. And that means we need to probe and ask questions. So that's why we, first of all, had the hearing. And I think under Joe Biden's leadership and now Dick Lugar's leadership, the Foreign Relations Committee over the last 2 years has really contributed to this very critical national debate about the future of our world and the future of our people. Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I'll try to shorten my answers up, and then we'll get to...
Do you have a question?
But I am a senator, and I just talk long and babble, and nobody cares. All right, yes.
Thank you for coming to speak at our campus. My question is, could you please explain the implications of the new Patriot Act as well as your views on that?
Well, I will give you a short answer on that because that is a large act. You know, that was the act that set in motion development of a new Homeland Security Department, which rolled together 22 departments and agencies, and we have Tom Ridge as secretary and all the things that have developed since September 11th to enhance our security in our country. I voted for it. I think it's right. It's imperfect. You'll never, ever be able to fit it right exactly. A huge task, awesome responsibility. We have never tried to essentially reform the federal government in the size and scope of what we're doing now since we rebuilt the Department of War and made it into the Department of Defense and built the Pentagon. I mean, this is an awesome, awesome responsibility. So it's difficult. Ridge has his hands full, the President, the Congress, all who are part of that. So I think I'd leave it at that to try to get a couple more questions in because it is needed. It's imperfect. We'll make mistakes. We'll make more mistakes. But we need to address the urgency of this threat, and I think generally this is the right way to do it.
We just have time for one more.
Okay.
One over here.
Senator, in light of all that's going on with Iraq and Korea, and it was reported on CNN this morning that Korea made an incursion by flight into South Korea, do you think that we're not putting enough emphasis on looking at a possible battle in Korea and too much emphasis on Iraq? As a Navy veteran, knowing how deployment schedules go, I know that we're extended to the point where we're about to break, yet we have this battle possibly looming with North Korea.
Well, you said it all, and you are a veteran and you understand it well, and I think most of America does. First, I think Korea poses the most urgent threat to our security anywhere in the world. We have 5 or 6 very significant threats out there today. I mentioned some of them in my remarks. Iraq surely is one. But they cannot be dealt with, as I mentioned, in vacuums. Let's do Iraq next month, and then we'll get to North Korea in July, and then we'll get back on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It doesn't work that way. This all comes at us at one time. They are interconnected. You can't pick and choose. And your point about the military capability to deal with all of these is a very good one. The operations tempo, Kansas, Nebraska, every state in this country, is every day getting more and more call-ups from reserves, National Guard. And by the way, we had many of them called up right after September 11th that have never been deactivated. There is a stretching point, there is a breaking point. The platforms on which we base our military superiority, our ships, our planes, many of those planes are very, very old. The average age of many of those fighters are 25 years old. B-52s are 50 years old. Those platforms crack. Those platforms do have a shelf life. And you can't run your people so fast, so hard, so often that they don't crack. So yes, this is what I referred to when I talked about great powers have limitations. That is a limitation of fact. So we're going to have to deal with it all. As you know, Secretary Powell is going to be in Asia this weekend, meeting with the leaders of China, South Korea, Japan. That's the way to do it. We have to put some attention on this, and we cannot focus all of our energy, our leadership, our attention, our resources on one thing, like Iraq. That's why I come back to where I started. Allies, coalitions, institutions, the United Nations, we have to have them with us. Last thing I would say, I will tell my friend John McCain that his auditorium you built for him is doing well, and I am going to tell him I think you took down his great poster-sized portrait and put mine up. He will be very happy to hear that. I was here, as you know, of course, in 1999 when McCain gave the lecture. His was far more insightful than mine, which I'll report to him. But I am his neighbor. I am next to him in the Senate building, the Russell building, and you're in there in the second floor of the Russell building, the main floor. McCain and I occupy the offices in one hallway. I do get combat pay for being next to him. And he was Navy, you know. Air Force, any Air Force veterans in here? I was with Admiral Ellis, who, you know, the Navy now runs STRATCOM in Omaha, you know that. Hell of a life. We're having now the Navy run everything. But I told the Air Force officers that I've never really thought the Air Force was a genuine branch of our military services. It's been more like a multinational corporation than a military institution. I say that because you've seen the kind of country clubs they have and get off at 5. But we appreciate your Air Force service. We appreciate all your service. And let me say again, so many of you here, although I don't know most of you personally, I do know many of you have served this country in many capacities, still do, especially those who help educate our young people and instill in them not just a great pride about our country and our values, but the responsibilities they have as citizens. And to you educators and parents, I am especially grateful, not only as a United States Senator, but as a father of a 10 and 12-year-old. I particularly appreciate what you do. And we couldn't do the job we try to do in Washington without your help. And to Kansas State, I wish you success in damn near everything. But thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was excellent. Thanks so much.